Oh, hi. I'm very pleased to be with you this evening to talk about lesser spotted woodpeckers. Specifically, what I want to talk about is the role of rare breeding panel in the monitoring of lesser spots. I'm not going to do much about ecology of lesser spots and why they're declining. That's another talk. So I'm focusing on the role of rare breeding panel this evening. Now, I've been involved with the panel for quite a long time. I was a member for many years, and in recent last few years, I've been the species advisor on lesser spotted woodpecker. My involvement in woodpeckers goes back a long way. Started in 1980s, but it was only in 2015 that with my wife Linda, we started Woodpecker Network to encourage study of woodpeckers in general, but especially focused on lesser spotted woodpecker. We really felt that the monitoring of the species had really dropped off. It was falling off people's radar, really, and we needed to generate a bit more interest to keep things going. So the prime aim was to collect data on lesser spotted woodpecker breeding success, because it was already thought that this was too low and this was one of the drivers of the decline. And we've done that pretty well over the last few years, and we would submit data to the BTO Nest Record Scheme and to the Rare Breeding Bird Panel. But initially, we weren't really focused on monitoring numbers or anything like that. Just as an indication of how well we've done in the last few years, these are the number of nest records for lesser spotted woodpeckers submitted each year from 83 through to 2022. The black lines are the ones submitted before Woodpecker Network started through the usual channels, usually bumbling along between 5 and 10 each year. There was a peak in 2007 when RSPB started some research projects on lesser spot, but then it was dropping right off. And so we came in 2015, and you can see we've got the numbers of nests found and monitored each year up to, say, 15 or 20 now. And since 2015, we've monitored 115 nests. And the distribution of those nests is shown there on the right, which pretty much covers the UK range of lesser spotted woodpecker, with nests all over the place covering that whole range, but a big clump down there in the middle of the south, which is the New Forest, where we've monitored over 40 nests now in the last few years. And I'll come back to the New Forest later in the talk. The Rare Breeding Bird Panel started monitoring lesser spots in 2020. This was driven by the small population size. The Avian Population Estimates Panel, APEP, came up with an estimate of 600 territories around this time, in a paper published in BB, I think. So low numbers, the population was clearly declining, and it was also clear that it was not very well monitored. So there was clearly a role for the Rare Breeding Bird Panel for this species. Along the bottom there, we've got some of the data. The BTO used to produce this common bird census trend for the lesser spotted woodpecker, which started in '66, went through a peak in the late '70s. That increase there is pretty clear. It was pretty clearly related to Dutch elm disease and the increase of food in the environment resulting from that. But then a steady decline, and then got to 2000, and the BTO felt there weren't enough lesser spots being picked up by the monitoring. They could no longer produce a reliable index. The other monitoring system in place are the periodic atlases, and here we've got in the middle here, the breeding distribution 2008 and 11, showing it's very much southern England and Wales based, a lot through the southeast, a lot in the Welsh Marches, then in Scotland and Ireland. But on the right there is the change map from that atlas, and the black squares indicate the changes from the two previous atlases. And so you can see there's a lot of black 10-kilometre squares in East Anglia and through Middle England and the southwest and in the northwest, but still pink through southeast England and the Marches. But of course, presence on a 10K square basis is quite a crude measure. a few weeks ago, I think about 3 weeks ago now, the BTO produced its new Birdfacts web pages. Now, if you haven't seen these, it's a fantastic resource. It really is brilliant. You ought to go and have a look. But I couldn't resist having a look at what they were now saying about lesser spots. And two things that are clear. On the left here is the change in distribution. So what the BTO have done is put those atlas changes in number of occupied 10K squares onto a graph here. So these are the number of 10K squares with lesser spots in the 3 atlases. And so in the last atlas, it was 560 10K squares. Now, to my mind, this means that that avian population estimate of 600 territories had to be far too low. It's inconceivable that there was only one pair of lesser spotted woodpeckers in each 10K square in that atlas time. And so subsequently, with Rob Clements and Linda, we actually analysed all the published tetrad atlases for England and Wales, really, and there are a lot of them all over the place. Took a bit of rounding up. And we came up with a conservative estimate of about 2,000 territories during that atlas period. And that could be quite low, really, but a lot more than the 600. So the number of territories is certainly higher than 600. Also, the BTO on the right here have produced a new trend graph. And so they've extended this trend through to now, really. Now, this is quite valuable, and it shows the big extent of the decline. The decline has carried on. But I have to be a bit nervous about this because, having said a decade or two ago, there weren't enough birds being counted to produce an index. You have to question what's going on now. And I've had a look at the BTO website and things, and when you go on to the species text for lesser spot, there's a whole load of caveats about this trend. It's actually saying that the trend is pretty unreliable, and really we should be looking to the rare breeding bird panel to monitor this species. And the reason it's unreliable is in these last few years, the breeding bird survey, which is now the main breeding bird monitoring scheme, is only picking up between 10 and 20 records per year of lesser spot. So even though you've got this graph that looks quite sensible, it's not very helpful in predicting what might go forward. So I can see there's massive value in seeing what's happened in the past and that big decline. But whether, given the data in the last 10 years or so, we'd actually be able to pick up any real trends with any confidence is questionable. So I think rare breeding panel still has a big role. Why is the lesser spot such a birding challenge? Well, it's a really difficult bird to find and see. It's small. It's now quite rare and limited in distribution, so you have to know where to go. If you go out bird watching at random, you're unlikely to come across one. It spends its whole life in the tops of trees. So when there are no leaves on, that's fine. But for the majority of the year, when there are leaves on the trees, that makes it pretty tough. Calling and drumming of these birds now is only for a short period of the year, and it's not very reliable. So you can go to a wood one day and not hear or see them, and then go the next, and there they are. So that's quite tricky. The other factor is that they're most detectable in February and March. So now is the time to be out doing lesser spots. And most breeding bird surveys haven't started then. The normal season is April to get started. So lesser spot, along with a few other resident woodland species, is not actually really picked up very well by the timing of some of the monitoring. From April onwards, they're invisible. They go quiet, the leaves are on the trees. If you're lucky, you might find a nest in May, but normally you won't. Often in some parts of the country, they're in inaccessible areas. This isn't a challenge of mountains or anything, it's private land. So Surrey is a classic example where a lot of the places it's really difficult to get into, and they are the sort of wet, wooded landscape that lesser spots are likely to be in. And the final factor here is I think it's dropped off what I call the birder's radar. people go to a special place to get it on their year list and don't even think that it's a bird in their patch that they ought to be looking for. I find this quite interesting. If you compare the winter distribution with the breeding distribution of the last atlas, the lesser spot was actually recorded in more squares in the winter distribution than in the breeding. And I think that reflects birds picked up by the timed tetrad visits in late winter when they became active. By the time the tetrad visits for the main atlas are being done, the lesser spots have gone quiet. Rare Breeding Bird Panel produced guidance for lesser spot recording. I had quite a hand in this, and it has all the usual criteria for possible breeding, probable breeding, proved breeding. To my mind, most of that doesn't really matter too much. The main factor now is whether the birds are actually present in the area. Going the next step to proving breeding or whatever is really quite tough and quite specialized. But in general, as a resident species, if they're around in the area, you can bet they're trying to breed. And so you're not worried about migrants being misrecorded or anything like that. And the key thing for the whole guidance is to get out early in the season. So in the guidance, we talk about from February through to June as a time to do any recording of lesser spots, including finding nests and things. I'd even actually say that you could include January in that as well. So this year, for instance, there's been a lot of lesser spot activity through January because January was pretty warm. So early season recording is the key message. Mark Eaton, when he took over for Mark Hollin as secretary of the panel, in one of his early reports, has produced these trend graphs for lesser spotted woodpecker. And it does look from the existing panel data that they've gone down by a few percent each year. The data's not that good. What I've done here on the right is actually extracted all the records each year, and a few points to make about that. The first is that the rare breeding panel are picking up 300 territories each year, compared with the BBS, which might be doing 10 or 20 if we're lucky. So that's why I think rare breeding bird panel has a big role to play, that actually a lot of lesser spots are being reported to the panel. The other thing to note is that big spike at the beginning of the trend there, and then it dropped off to being flat thereafter. That was thought to be the result of field work for the National Atlas, meaning more birds recorded. It does raise the question of recording effort and how you kind of standardize that in monitoring. Now, traditionally, Rare Breeding Bird Panel have published total numbers for each of the species they're monitoring. And that's absolutely fine for the really rare species, and for the species where there are annual monitoring schemes in place, like, for instance, the bittern, and the sort of rare birds of prey where you're pretty sure you're getting all the numbers. But for species like lesser spot, there is no way you're ever going to count them all. So you have to come up with a method of producing an index rather than just the numbers. So you could use the numbers as an index, but that's fraught with problems. And there's a new approach on the block which may help with this. It's called occupancy modeling. Now, for these statistical techniques, you can always buy great books on them. And if most people like me, you can read about the first 6 pages and then it becomes pretty incomprehensible. But there's well-developed methods now for modeling occurrence of species in places or time or whatever. And this occupancy modeling is rather similar to the models that are used to model survival rates of colouring birds. And so what the system you have is multiple years, over multiple years. If this was colouring birds, it would be different individual birds, but for lesser spots, it could be the sites on which they occur. And you visit the sites, and in this year, lesser spots were found. That year, nobody got to the site. Lesser spots found all the way through here, 2028. In this example, none were found in 29, and then some were found in 30. And then you've got all different combinations. So doing this slide, I got a bit bored with the combinations. But essentially what you can do with this method is to estimate not only the presence of the lesser spots on the site, but the probability that you would have detected them. And that's really important because they're so difficult to detect. You've got to allow for that. We do need to do a little bit extra with rare breeding bird panel data. We need to think about getting lists of lesser spot sites in each county, and we need to devise a way for the recorders to say whether those sites were checked or not. But I don't think this is onerous. I think it's pretty straightforward to pull that together. So that's my first idea for way forward, and it links quite nicely to the next one, and that's county surveys. Now, for a long time, I thought it was impossible to do county surveys of lesser spots. But actually in Hampshire last year, with Rob Clements again, Linda and I organised a county survey, which actually worked pretty well. And what we did is we selected 1 kilometre squares. I think 1 kilometre square is the appropriate scale for this kind of feasible areas to survey. And we had standard methods, 3 visits through March, early April, over the whole county, and we selected nearly 200 1 kilometre squares, 135 in the New Forest, 64 in the rest of Hampshire. We adopted the same survey methods in all of them, but we had different sampling strategies. So in the New Forest, we knew there were lots of birds, and so we scored the different squares for suitable habitat and surveyed those, and that was quite easy. For the rest of Hampshire, we did something which I think is more applicable to other counties, where we went through the bird records submitted to the recorder, Keith Betton at the time, and selected squares that had records of lesser spots over the last decade and sorted it out that way. So I think that's a good way forward. What we found in Hampshire is we actually found 180 plus territories, which is amazing. 174 in the New Forest, only 7 in the rest of Hampshire. So we fear there's probably a decline going on there. And the total county population came out at 300, which is amazing. That's about 15% of the British population. And we will be writing this up for the Hampshire Bird Report. And we're actually thinking of doing a paper in BB on it as well, because we think it has much wider applicability than just Hampshire. The other advantage of doing this is it kind of sets a baseline for future monitoring. So you can then go back to the occupancy monitoring using the sites you surveyed first time round and really have a good monitoring scheme going forward. So that's my time up, I think. So thank you for listening. In summary, I think Rare Breeding Bird Panel has a key role to play in monitoring this species, and I hope we can develop that monitoring to be really much more useful in the future. Thank you.